So let's be fair to everyone who was in time here today with us. My name is Paula Ellinger. I'm currently Climate Action Director at Fundación Avina, and it's my pleasure and honor to welcome you today to this virtual meeting, a very important step into Impulsouth's project. This event is part of the PCCB Network events on capacity building, and we truly thank all the PCCB Network's team support in organizing this. And it's co-organized with the Adaptation Fund, and I kindly thank the support from our guest speaker, who is going to speak later today, Farai from the Adaptation Fund. This event, as you're probably aware, is a very important moment to Impulsouth, which is a South-South cooperation project run between 6 countries to strengthen the capacities for climate action in the developing world towards strengthening engagement from the South in climate negotiations. In this respect, we have run as a network of partners research assessment on capacities and knowledge needs and gaps for assessing the impacts, risks, and vulnerabilities of climate change. This process started roughly a year ago, where we gathered together as partners, and in a moment I'm going to mention you all of those who are part of the network, but we gathered together to develop and validate a common research methodology, and then the research teams led an amazing work of translating the common methodology to the national context, and today we're going to hear some of the findings of this process. But most important is that we hope that the research process can inspire greater action for climate adaptation. And this is why the title of this event is Moving from Needs Assessment to Action, an agenda to build capacities in adaptation planning. Because we hope that these research results that will be shared here today are just a first step for a strengthened agenda to build capacities and take action for climate adaptation in the 6 countries that are object of this research, but further beyond in the Global South. So before moving into the agenda of the day, I just want to share very quickly, Impulsouth is a collaborative alliance of organizations that is funded by the IDRC, the International Development Research Center, coordinated by Fundación Avina, in collaboration with Flaxo Ecuador, the United Nations University, and research partners in Uganda, Zambia, Niger, Madagascar, Dominican Republic, and Guatemala. You're going to hear from the research partners in a bit, but they are the Universidad del Valle in Guatemala, the Universidad Nacional Pedro Enriquez Ureña in Dominican Republic, CHAI in Uganda, the Wascau Center in Niger, the Laboratory of Applied Research in Madagascar, part of the Antananarivo University, and the Copperbelt University in Zambia. With that, could you please move forward to the next slide? One slide further, please. Yes, now the agenda. One back, please, for the agenda. Just want to quickly share with you. So after this very brief introduction of the purpose of this event and the research process that led us here today, I will give the words to Lily Burmo, a PCCB Network member, for a welcome. And then we are going into the presentations of the main findings of the research by 6 research leaders. And then we're gonna move to reflections and experiences from the Adaptation Fund on funding based on capacity needs assessment. The last part of this event, the last 25 minutes, will be dedicated to an open discussion. But of course, if you have comments or questions at any point of this session, please use the chat to share your ideas, your reflections, your questions. We'll try to make it as interactive as possible. With that, I kindly give the word to you, Lily Bermo, please.
Thank you, Paula. Good morning and good afternoon to everyone joining today. My name is Lily Bermel. I'm a member of the Paris Committee on Capacity Building, PCCB, and part of our Working Group 4 on identifying capacity gaps and needs. I would like to welcome you all to the webinar today, organized by the PCCB Network and Impulsouth in collaboration with the Adaptation Fund. I'm excited to announce that today's webinar will be dedicated to building capacities in adaptation and how to take that crucial step from needs assessment to climate action. But before we go into the depths of this event and introduce our panelists, I'd like to quickly introduce you to the PCCB. Established at COP21 in 2015, the PCCB seeks to address current and emerging gaps and needs in implementing and further enhancing capacity building in developing countries. The mission of the PCCB is to identify capacity gaps and needs and potential solutions, including enhancing the coherence and coordination of capacity building efforts related to climate change. Being the newest member of the PCCB, I joined a few months ago, I seek to contribute effectively to this objective of the PCCB to enhance global climate action. To support its mandate and mission, the committee launched the PCCB Network in 2020 as a voluntary association of interested stakeholders engaged in a climate-related capacity building. This PCCB network provides a platform to share information on best practices, contributes to the work of the PCCB in fulfilling its mandate, and seeks to connect with its peers across sectors and regions. At the moment, the network unites 310 organizations addressing several areas of capacity building. The PCCB regularly mobilizes the expertise of its network members through events like these, but also at the regional level through PCCB side events and at the UNFCCC Regional Climate Weeks. Also at the international level through the Capacity Building Hub at the UNFCCC COPs. To learn more about the PCCB network and how to become a member and its collaboration possibilities as a member, please follow the link in the chat. But coming back to today's session, I look forward to the discussions on capacity needs and gaps shared by researchers from the Dominican Republic, Guatemala, Zambia, Uganda, Madagascar, and Niger. Adaptation planning is fundamental to our collective actions and reactions to the climate crisis. Therefore, now and in the coming years, advancing climate adaptation planning efforts through the assessment of vulnerabilities, risks, and assessments on national levels becomes a key priority in the climate-related capacity building landscape. But at the same time, there is a growing need to address adaptation planning in the beginning of the national adaptation policy cycle, as it is pivotal to collective progress on the global goal on adaptation. Taking the research process of capacity needs assessment into account as an enabler for capacity building will be at the center of the following discussions today. Additionally, we will also reflect on the experiences related to funding for adaptation based on such capacity needs and assessments. So once again, on behalf of the Paris Committee on Capacity Building, I would like to thank Impulsouth and the Adaptation Fund for collaborating to deliver this event, and to all of the speakers and audiences. Now back over to you, Paula. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lily. I would just like to make a kind reminder in name of the translators team for everyone speaking, please speak slowly so that they have the capacity to transform all the conversations into 3 languages. I would like to kindly pass now the moderation of the presentation of main findings to the research coordinator of the process, Mrs. Pilar Bueno. please, Pilar, the floor is yours to facilitate these presentations.
Thank you very much, Paula, and apologies for coming late. We have some issue with the link of the call. With respect to that, let me please start by saying that it was my privilege, along with Ignacio Lorenzo, to officiate as the research coordinators of this process. And we have the opportunity to conduct together and collaborate with the 6 national teams and all the partners of Impulsouth these action research plans that are focused on assessing impacts, vulnerabilities, and risks of climate change with an emphasis on gender. Let me also emphasize that this topic was selected by the national focal points as a priority, so this is very important for the project. Along with Ignacio, and for the purpose of this research process in particular, we developed together a guideline that aims to accompany and to give some ideas to the research team with respect to how to carry out the research projects, how to develop the research plans first, and then how to conduct the research process. During this design and as part of the guideline that is translated and published in English, in French, and also in Spanish, you will find some components or main features of the action research plans that were submitted and approved last year, focus on specific scoping of the research proposals, seeking to have a context-specific conversation, always on assessing impacts, vulnerabilities, and risk of climate change, with this emphasis on gender. Also to understand gender considerations and specific scope of each of the national research teams in terms of a sector, a territory, a particular vulnerability. So you will have the opportunity to listen from the different teams, which were the different specific scoping that they selected. If it's what was agriculture, water, coastal management, there are some common topics between the different groupings. We also invited the teams to identify specific objectives, to make a literature review, and of course to work with a theoretical and conceptual framework, making use of the capacity building UNFCCC framework that the PCCB is working so far, to develop also an initial hypothesis, trying to provide a first diagnosis of national capacity gaps and needs in relation to the desired outcomes, and of course to have a methodological design, including different types of tools that we offer in the guideline, and of course the different teams decided the best combination of these tools. So without more dilation, I would like to invite Daniel Abreu. He is from Dominican Republic. I would like to invite Daniel, that is part of Universidad Nacional Pedro Enríquez Ureña, to have the first presentation. Let me please just recall to everyone in this conversation that you will have 5 minutes to start and to make your presentation. And then after each of the teams has finished the 5 minutes, we will have an opportunity to start a conversation and also to answer some questions. So please be as respectful as possible with the time, since we are a lot of people here and we want to have some time for exchange. Daniel, please, you have the floor, and thank you.
Thank you, Pilar. And so it's my pleasure to share the research that we have developed in the Dominican Republic. And basically our scope was to identify the main institutional gaps, especially in the tourism and agriculture sectors. And tourism mainly focus on the coastal area tourism. We also prioritize not exclusive, but a priority was a focus on government capacity and basically to assess climate impacts, vulnerabilities, and risk. We used a mix of research methods, basically survey for key stakeholders. We did interviews, consultation to experts, and a very in-depth DEX research. We found much more data research that has not been published in the Dominican Republic. So that was also like a finding that we actually have a lot of information. And we consulted around 22 key institutions among the government. Basically, we have a Presidential National Council on Climate Change, the Ministry of Environment, Tourism, Agriculture. We also included Ministry of Women, Ministry of Youth, that is not in the PowerPoint, we also consulted, and universities and NGOs. Please, the next slide. So the main needs and gaps that we identified many more, but this will be like maybe the key 5 ones. So first is there is a gap in consistent technical capacities. We have capacities, but they are not consistent and between different sectors and government institutions to assess climate vulnerability, especially sensitive to gender and vulnerable groups. That's a missing link. We also, the second main gap we identified is in tourism and agriculture official institutions to assess risk at a local scale. They do it on a national scale, more or less well, but local scale is missing. We have a third gap that is a need to strengthen action for public information and sensitization. This is across all sectors, not only these ones, but also including the agriculture and tourism. We have a gap in get stable financing for research. And finally, we need to research and improve women and youth participation in climate resilience policies. So the recommendations that go pretty much along these needs and gaps identified first is to strengthen the technical capacities of key official institutions for assessing climate vulnerability and risk. A second recommendation is to develop instruments to make it feasible and practical to transfer capacities generated at national level to the local level, which is something that hasn't happened yet. We also recommend to have a public awareness campaign in climate resilience that is led by official institutions with participation of academia. A fourth recommendation is to strengthen technical capacities to access climate financing, mainly targeted at evaluating climate risk and increasing resilience. And finally, our last recommendation to share is that we strongly recommend to implement a permanent space for participation and dialogue with climate policymakers, prioritizing women and youth. And actually, from the interviews that we conducted to key institutions dealing with youth and women, they have already taken some steps. And even last weekend, there was a dialogue. And that was more or less influences because of this research, that they make it a priority when we were actually requesting information about it. So we already can say we have some results about this. So thank you. This is my short summary on our findings in the Dominican Republic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And it sounds really exciting to already have this kind of outcomes of the research process, not only a document and a very rich process as you expressed, but also this kind of opportunity. So probably we will have more time to engage with respect to know a little bit more about this process, this dialogue that you are describing. Thank you, Daniel. I would like to please provide Jacqueline Brinker the opportunity to take the floor. She is from the Guatemalan team. and she is part of the Center for Environmental Studies and Biodiversity. Jacqueline, you have the floor.
Thank you, Pilar, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you all here. Going to present the research from our team. Actually, we work together with Gaby Fuentes, which is who is right next to me here. But in order to spend the less time, I'm going to present by myself. So the scope of research of our country was to assess the needs and gaps of knowledge and capacities for the evaluation of impacts, vulnerabilities, and risks of climate change in the marine coastal sector of the country, with an emphasis on gender. As you can see here, there is a map of Guatemala, and you can see there is the Atlantic Ocean and also Pacific Ocean. So that's why we prioritize the marine coastal sector. For the research, we use different methods. First, we did an initial research where we reviewed some technical documents, but also normative, legal, and strategic instruments. And also, we made a mapping and prioritization of stakeholders. I'm sorry. I think there's a lot of noise in the background. I will try to move. I'm sorry. I'm here at the airport, so I'm trying to move somewhere else. Just let me know if it's better from here.
Jacqueline, anyway, we can hear okay, so no worries.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm really sorry. Okay, so then we collected some information and primary data. We made an initial workshop to present the project with main stakeholders. As you can see, there's a picture of all the events. We're trying to do all the events online because of COVID. And then we made some focal groups, and finally some bilateral interviews in order to complete the information that we weren't able to gather at the initial workshop. And finally, we made an analysis of the information and the preparation of the final report. As you can see, there were a lot of stakeholders, making a total of 50 institutions, 7 from the government, 2 from academia, 1 from private sector, 4 NGOs, and 1 project that is related to the marine coastal sector. At the end, we had the participation of 26 people, of which 58% are women and 38% are young. So we try to take that in consideration. The next one, please. Thank you. So in summary, after all the research we made, we found a lot of different needs and gaps. So this is only a summary, as you can see, but we found out that there is a lack of public funds and the lack of a stable civil service career. So what we recommended for this is to strengthen the budget of the institutions that manage coastal marine areas in the country. Then we also found that there is a lack of databases with historical and current information that is robust or consistent over time and that is standardized. So for this, we recommend to strengthen the network of all the meteorological and hydrological stations in the country, and also to implement oceanographic stations, because we don't have any in the country, and also to standardize all the methodological protocols that we use right now. Then we also found that women's involvement in data collection is limited, and also women and youth have not been part of decision-making on, in general, environmental issues in coastal marine areas. So for this, we recommend that women's development initiatives and programs need to be strengthened, and also to ensure the capacity building and information being transferred to women, to strengthen the women's organizations, but also to strengthen the municipal youth offices to involve them. Then we found out that the access to information and its dissemination is very complicated, especially for local users. So for this, we need to strengthen information, the information systems to generate local information using simple and informative language for all sectors and also for educational levels, and to design early warning systems that take into account gender equality, multiculturalism, and people with disabilities. And finally, we found out that governance in the sector is deficient, as there is a very weak coordination between the different institutions linked to the sector. And for this, we wanted to, or we recommend to ensure that all policies have an action plan to establish a clear institutional leadership and also to strengthen institutional presence in coastal marine sectors. So as you can see, there's a lot that we have to improve in the country. So we really hope that this research helps the country to develop, especially the marine coastal sector. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline, as well as Gabriela, for all these very interesting process and also project and outcome that we are today sharing with all the audience. So thank you very much. As we said before, we'll have an opportunity to engage in some minutes after all the researchers can have their presentation, so to have a first engagement and questions and comments for sure. So I would like to, before inviting the next speaker, just to remind everyone to please speak slowly so that the English speakers can follow all the process. And again, with that, I will invite Felix Calava from the Zambian team and of Copperfield University to make the presentation of the team. Felix, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, and it is a privilege to be with all of you and share our research output from Zambia. Kindly take us to the slide for Zambia, please. Zambia. Okay, thank you so much. So in terms of what we're looking at, we basically try to assess the institutional capacity and needs and gaps, focusing mainly on the Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Green Economy and Environment. And this ministry was looked at because of the fact that that's where the meteorological department sits. And we wanted to assess the impacts, vulnerability, risks that climate change faces with the others and emphasis on gender. In terms of the methods that we used desk review, key informal interviews, as well as focus group discussions to assess the institutional capacities and needs. And I must mention that what we did was we held focus group discussions at 3 levels. With the Ministry of Agriculture, we had meetings at the district level, at the provincial level, as well as at the national level. These are the 3 layers of governance that we have. And then for the Ministry of Green Economy and Environment, focusing on the meteorological department, this was, so for the Ministry of Green Economy and Environment, we looked at 2 levels, which is the provincial level and the national level. Now, the reason why this was the case is because the meteorological department does not exist at district level. They do not have any officers at district level. The officers only exist, or structures only exist at provincial and national level. So we had these interviews, and the participants within the focus group comprised of men and women. And then we also had key informal interviews that ensured that we bridge the gap by bringing the different gender on the research process. Maybe we can now move on to the results. There are quite a number of gaps. The first gap that I'd like to share with you is that for the Ministry of Agriculture, while climate information is really important in informing agriculture and developing adaptation strategies. The Ministry of Agriculture has no mandated staff to receive weather information from the meteorological department. And this, as well as they do not have a clear laid down procedure on how this information is supposed to be passed on. Now, it is important to note that the meteorological department does give 10 days focus, weather focus, but this information is shared with the Ministry of Agriculture. But unfortunately, within the Ministry of Agriculture, they have not yet developed mechanisms of receiving and sharing weather information. And yeah, so the second one is that there is actually poor working framework between the meteorological department and the Ministry of Agriculture with respect to flow of weather information. The other weakness or gap that we found was in relation to weather information is that this weather information from meteorological department is never downscaled into farmer recommendations for farmer updates. So farmers want information. They want information like when is the onset of rain, the duration of the rain, the distribution of rainfall. This information is not provided to farmers. And then the other thing that we also observed was the fact that when it comes to the Ministry of Agriculture, all the planning is heavy on the top, and it is not done with participation of people on the at the lower scale. So it's actually top down rather than bottom up. Now, this is a major weakness because those who experience climate risks are at the lower scale, and we need to first of all appreciate how climate change is impacting them, understanding how the risks that they experience. But this information is not really filtered into the whole process. So women and youth, as well as other vulnerable groups, we may not be aware their vulnerability as well as exposure is not fully integrated. Why? Because of little local information. So there are quite a number of recommendations that I'll share just in the interest of time. We're looking at ensuring that there is a clear line between Ministry of Agriculture on how they receive climate information, weather information, as well as passing it down. Improving early warning system is actually key, and ensure the cooperation between Department of Meteorology as well as Ministry of Agriculture. The special emphasis is the fact that in Zambia, most of the farmers depend on rain-fed agriculture. In the continent Africa, 95% of the farmers depend on rain-fed agriculture. This therefore tells us that there is need for strengthened collaboration, understanding of capacities between the departments responsible for meteorology as well as agriculture, as well as downscaling weather information to the local people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Felix, for this insightful presentation. Let me please invite John Baptist Kadu from the Uganda team to make his presentation too. He's from the Climate Change Adaptation Innovation Child. So please, Dr. Kadu, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Now, I'm not going to the details. The activity was undertaken, of course, in Uganda, but we picked one of the local governments. It was not a national level activity because the funds were not enough to cover the national level approach. We thought that if we take a segment of the country, one district, then it could be a representative of others, and the activity could be scaled up. In terms of scope, indeed enlarged, I can't read it. The study was carried out in Nakasongola district. This is a cattle corridor. Nakasongola district is the granary of the country. It stretches diagonal across from the southwest to the northeast. And that's where we got a lot of food produced in the country and cattle. So there's a lot of agro activities. That's why we picked that. The research method used with desk review, mainly desk review literature from various segments of the country, and of course from the global, the UNCCC literature and literature from other UN agencies. The key information, we also use the key informant interviews, interview the key people that are linked to vulnerability assessment in the district. We also use the focus group discussions, groups of people taking into consideration the government entities, taking into considerations UN agencies and non-government organizations that operate in the district were taken care of, and of course, gender balance. The data was analyzed and then presented. Qualitative data was collected, and we used also voice recording, and then we transcribed that into Excel, and we were able to do some statistical analysis. The stakeholder category were from Nakasongola district, local government, civil society, NGOs, as I've indicated earlier on. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of needs and gaps and recommendation, the main needs and gaps, there was inadequate capacity for climate change planning at the district level for various reasons. There was also, we found inadequacy in funding and weak infrastructure in the district. We also found that there were very few staff that had skills in climate change vulnerability assessment and development of climate change adaptation and mitigation planning. Furthermore, approaches used for vulnerability assessment fall short of the nationally recommended standards as outlined in the National Climate Change Training Manual. We have a National Climate Change Training Manual, which, by the way, is online. Furthermore, refresher training for staff previously trained in vulnerability assessment, there were the needs and gaps in that area. Now, in terms of recommendation and response to these needs and gaps, there's a need to build the capacity of the district in climate change action and climate change planning and adaptation. Establish a climate change office to galvanize planning and response. These will be key aspects. Furthermore, the recommendation, something about infrastructure support and financial resource mobilization to facilitate planning, to facilitate data collection and storage and retrieval, digitization of weather stations, improvement of computers, in other words, IT-related kind of activities support. Furthermore, recommendation and training on climate change vulnerability assessment and participatory planning, climate change action planning. The issue of vulnerability assessment is key and needs to be addressed strictly. We need a refresher training for using the updated training manual on vulnerability assessment. And lastly, in terms of recommendation, there's capacity enhancement needed in gender mainstreaming, specifically in climate change oriented actions. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kadu, for your presentation. And let's have the opportunity to listen Dr. Sohasina from the team of Madagascar. And he is from the École supérieure des sciences agronomiques, Université d'Antananarivo. Please, Dr. Su, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for the floor. I am very happy to share with you. the main finding of Madagascar research. I will be brief. I will be brief with my presentations. For Madagascar, the research is focused on water sector because this sector is the most affected by climate change. And we choose also the city of Antananarivo, which is the most populated area of the country. And about the research method, we used especially individual survey by using of questionnaire. And we also, during the workshop organized with stakeholders, we gather information through open discussion and also from through group work. And we used...
Excuse me, Dr. Su, I sorry to interrupt, just to let you know that you have the opportunity to make your presentation in French, just in case you decide to do so. Apologies for the interruption.
Yes, yes, if I can also continue with English, but slowly. If I can continue, but I can also speak French if you, if it's needs. I will speak in French. Yes. Pour Madagascar, donc la recherche a été focalisée sur le secteur eau, puisque c'est un des plus touchés par l'effet de changement climatique. Et nous avons orienté la recherche sur la ville d'Antananarivo, qui est donc le plus peuplé de la grande île, et l'effet de changement climatique est un peu plus prononcé. Pour la méthode utilisée, c'est l'enquête, le focus group, aussi pour l'interaction entre les acteurs, puisque à partir des interactions, on a pu donc identifier les recommandations et aussi les problèmes entre les institutions surtout, et aussi individuels. Pour les stakeholders, nous avons pu impliquer au moins 6 catégories, ministères et les institutions rattachées, les NGO, c'est-à-dire le ONG, société civile, institutions de recherche, et aussi donc les organisations territoriales décentralisées, les communes et tout ça. Voilà donc les principales stakeholders à impliquer dans le processus. Est-ce qu'on peut passer, s'il vous plaît, à la... Voilà. Voilà, donc je pense qu'il y a toute une similarité. Hein. Il a toute une similarité avec les autres pays. Il y a toute une similarité avec les autres pays, puisque l'accès et l'inexistence des données, c'est donc parmi le besoin, l'insuffisance de matériel et ressources, puisque station climatique, c'est presque non fonctionnel à Madagascar. Les logiciels de traitement des informations, ce sont tous de la thune. Et surtout, le problème de capacité, hein, surtout de capacité technique pour l'évaluation de vulnérabilité, capacité d'exploitation de informations pour l'analyse de risque. Et surtout, cette capacité-là manque bien. Problème rattaché à la gouvernance, c'est donc l'inexistence des institutions, des bases de données nationales et des systèmes de coordination de cette base, puisque l'accès à cette base nécessite une organisation et une gouvernance structurée. C'est pour cela que ça nécessite vraiment d'être réfléchi. Et vraiment, on doit promouvoir les partenariats avec les projets pour cette question d'équipement, pour cette question, surtout pour cette question de ressources, à la fois financières et matérielles. On doit promouvoir le partenariat. Et aussi, on doit faire des renforcements de capacités, à la fois pour les institutions, pour les individus et pour aussi oui, à la fois les institutions et les individus, pour tout ce qui est de l'évaluation de vulnérabilité, quelles sont les informations nécessaires, comment faire surtout concernant la méthodologie applicable pour l'échelle régionale, l'échelle locale et tout ça. Et finalement, la recommandation s'oriente aussi sur le renforcement de structures de coordination pour l'accès, pour l'essence des informations, pour l'accès aux informations, pour l'évaluation de vulnérabilité et risques. Voilà un peu ce que je peux dire. Merci de votre attention.
Merci beaucoup, Dr. So. Let me please go ahead with the presentation of Ibrahim Boubacar. He is part of the team of Niger, and he integrates the Université Amadou Mornoumi. Excusez-moi pour la prononciation. You have the floor, sir. You have your 5 minutes. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Pilar. So on behalf of our team in Niger, I would like to thank the Impulsouth coordinator for giving us the opportunity to undertake this study in Niger, and also for the different support during the process. So the scope of the study in Niger is assessment of knowledge, capacity needs and gap on the issue of assessing the impact, vulnerabilities and the risks of climate change in the agricultural sector. And emphasizes on gender. So our focus is on agriculture in Niger. Niger is a Sahelian country of a rain-fed agriculture, which is highly exposed to the different effects of climate change, characterized by low rainfall amount and also higher temperature. On the issue of gender, we have noted there is a high inequity between men and women in terms of employment and economic status, and also we have a limited access of women to education and also to land. There is also a low participation of women in the economy and decision making. So in order to better analyze these situations, the methodology that we have adopted is based on the stakeholders mapping in order to identify the main stakeholders that are involved in the sector of climate change and agriculture in Niger, from the individual level, institutional and a systematic level. To characterize also the agricultural sector, we have done a desktop review and also to evaluate the gender issue in the sector of agriculture. And then we have made some survey, some discussion groups, and also organize a workshop in order to evaluate the capacity, weaknesses, and needs of the different stakeholders and institutions from the local level to the institutional level. So this have helped us to gather a lot of data that from the analysis of this data, we have elaborated some propositions and recommendations in order to fill some of the gaps. Please, next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Hello. Yeah. So the summary of the results in terms of needs and gaps, and also recommendation are presented in this table. So for the needs and gap, first we noted an insufficient competencies in farmers supervision from the local level to the national level, and also a low capacity in data collection because there is a low human resources, and also we noted that there is low equipment. So to resolve this needs and gap, we propose that there is a need to strengthen their capacity through capacity building and acquisition of equipment for the different services for data collection, and also to facilitate farmers supervision. There is also an efficient competencies for data analysis and processing, and also the different technical services. So this concerns how to generate climate information or some information regarding agricultural sector. So for this, there is also a need of capacity building and also acquisition of computing equipment at the different level. There is also a low education and training infrastructure in the sector. So the proposition is to create new schools, universities, and institutions for trainings, and also for the capacity building. So there is also an insufficient platform and a low synergy between this existing platform. So there is a need to overcome this issue. There is a need to strengthen the platform and also to reinforce the support of this platform by the government or the funding institutions. There is also a barriers for women employment. So to resolve this issue, there is a need to create platforms and also groups of women in the, and also to make some improvements of the institutional arrangement in order to promote women in the different activities in the agricultural sector. Last not the least, there is a low communication and low sensitization on the issue of climate change. So there is a need of reinforcing capacity building for medias, and also to disseminate some many results of on climate change issue in the region, and mainly in Niger, so that more people will be aware about this issue of climate change. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim, and for this presentation. Now I would like to invite you to maybe move to the next part of the agenda, and maybe we can keep, since we are a little bit behind the schedule, maybe we can move to the presentation of the representative of the Adaptation Fund, and then during the time that we are going to have for open discussions, we have the opportunity to come back and make the comments and questions and all the interaction that for sure will be very, very important and well received by the national research teams. So with that, let me please invite Fray Onayes from the Readiness Program for Climate Change of the Adaptation Fund to make the presentation. Please, you have the floor.
Hello, good morning, everyone, and good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. So I was actually going to share my screen, and apparently I'm getting a pop-up that says I can't share my screen so that I can give the presentation.
Yes, please, Mari, can you stop sharing your screen? Thank you. Now you would be, I think
All
you
right.
can share it now.
Okay, thank you. So my name is Farai Madziwa, and I coordinate the Readiness program for the Adaptation Fund. And for those of you who might not be aware, so the Adaptation Fund has only the one office, and we don't have regional office or satellite offices. So we have only the one office, and we're based in Washington, DC. In my presentation, I'm going to just give a brief overview of the Adaptation Fund for those of you who may not fully know what the Adaptation Fund is and how it operates. And then I'll also talk about the challenges of accessing adaptation finance from the Adaptation Fund perspective and from our experience. And then I'll talk about some of the activities and initiatives we have in place to address some of these gaps and challenges. And then I'll also talk about the opportunities for funding projects and programs on the ground from the Adaptation Fund. And hopefully this will give an overview of kind of where we are in terms of identifying needs and addressing those needs. So the Adaptation Fund became operational in 2007 under the UNFCCC and specifically under the Kyoto Protocol. And when it was established, it was the only fund, and I think it still is under the UNFCCC, the only fund that is dedicated to funding adaptation, exclusively adaptation only. So the Adaptation Fund doesn't do mitigation or any other projects, it only funds adaptation. And we say we fund concrete adaptation projects and programs. And concrete in the sense that the projects have to be visible, tangible, and they have to be measurable as well. And the fund provides only grants, and it does not do other financial instruments or lending or provide other financial instruments like equity finance and the like. So we are a purely grant-based fund. The Adaptation Fund also does direct access, and this is one of the niche areas of the Adaptation Fund, is that we do what we call direct access to climate finance. I think we were one of the first funds also to introduce this direct access to financing under the UNFCCC. And what it is that the fund is set up to transfer adaptation finance to developing countries without the use of a third party. So for example, traditional forms of financing have involved maybe transfer from the international level, it goes to an intermediary, such as maybe a UN agency or a development bank, and then the money is transferred from that intermediary down to the government. So our direct access financing model transfers funds directly from the international level, which is the Adaptation Fund, straight to the government without the need of a third party. And to date, the fund has grown since it was established. It was established to be financed through the Clean Development Mechanism under the Kyoto Protocol. But because the carbon market has been very low now for many, many years, and there's very little funding that has been coming from CDM and the credit, in the carbon credit market, we have been relying mostly on voluntary contributions from mostly from developed countries at national governments, but also we have been receiving voluntary contributions from subnational governments like cities, mostly from developed countries. So to date, the funding that has cumulatively been available, I'll try to move a little fast, otherwise maybe I might take a lot of time. That has been cumulatively available under the fund has been close to $1 billion cumulatively. We have projects that are in the pipeline. That means projects that are ready to be funded are about $300 million. So there is, this to us at least signifies that there is demand for funding from the Adaptation Fund. And this money has basically, in our portfolio of funded projects, we have about 123 projects that are approved and funded. And the impact of that funding is that these projects have reached about 31.5 million beneficiaries, and have resulted in the training of at least 1.25 million people being trained in climate change, climate resilience, and climate change adaptation. So we have also funded about 415 early warning systems in the countries that have received funding from the Adaptation Fund through the projects that are being implemented on the ground. And the funding has also resulted in the restoration of at least about 381,000 hectares of natural habitat, the protection of about 162,000 meters of coastline. And this funding through direct access is through what we call national implementing entities. And the national implementing entities have to become accredited in order to be receiving funding from the Adaptation Fund. And currently we have 34 national implementing entities accredited with the fund. That means we have 34 countries that have an entity that is accredited to receive financing from the Adaptation Fund. So the portfolio has been growing over the years, and the biggest, at least from our portfolio at the moment, the region receiving the highest amount of funding from the Adaptation Fund is currently Africa, which is 42% of our funding goes to Africa, and closely followed by Latin America and the Caribbean and Asia Pacific, which are more or less the same, 26% and 28% respectively. But in terms of the allocation of funding in these regions, I just want to mention that, so accessing finance from the Adaptation Fund is done on a country-driven and country-driven basis. So that means the Adaptation Fund doesn't necessarily dictate where the money goes. It's purely based on the how quickly these countries in these regions meet the requirements to access funding, and therefore that results in the financial flows to those regions. So it's a country-driven process by the countries. So some of the challenges that we have identified in terms of accessing finance. So the Adaptation Fund did some research, and we developed a study or a publication called Bridging the Gaps in Accreditation. And this publication basically outlines from our perspective and the perspective of the accreditation panel of the Adaptation Fund, what some of the entities and institutions struggle with in terms of accessing climate finance from the Adaptation Fund. And one of the things they found was that there are challenges with familiarization of the accreditation process and the criteria to become accredited. And accreditation is important because an entity has to become accredited in order to be eligible to submit projects or programs for funding by the Adaptation Fund, and in order to be able to receive funding from the Adaptation Fund. So accreditation, therefore, is kind of like the central core of being able to receive funding from the Adaptation Fund. So in terms of going through this accreditation process, a lot of entities, institutions, and governments don't have a firm grasp or understanding of the process and the criteria and the requirements. And in terms of understanding also the documentation requirements to provide evidence of meeting the fiduciary criteria necessary for accreditation. Another challenge is regular communication between the Adaptation Fund focal points in the countries and also the institutions and entities that have been nominated by these focal points to go through the accreditation process and receive funding from the Adaptation Fund. And communication is important. It's communication in country, but communication also between the country representatives and the Adaptation Fund Secretariat and the Adaptation Fund Board. And that communication between the fund and the country is important because it can help clarify and ensure that any uncertainties in terms of the requirements of accreditation or accessing climate finance from the Adaptation Fund can quickly be addressed through communication. There is also a challenge with institutional memory and effective handover in country between government departments and entities that have to go through the process of accreditation. And this is affected by staff mobility and movement of staff within institutions in country. And there are also challenges with commitment, high commitment by top management, and close engagement between senior management of different government departments or different institutions in country, which is important in order for these entities and institutions to be able to prepare action plans to respond to any gaps that are identified. You know, and they can do this, for example, by setting up internal policies and systems to enable those gaps to be addressed, or working with partners in other parts of government or different entities, institutions in country in order to have a coordinated approach towards addressing those gaps. And there's a challenge of tracking outstanding issues. And here I say outstanding issues because there are sometimes there's a need to ensure that focus is maintained on residual requirements of going through the process of accreditation or accessing climate finance or adaptation finance from the Adaptation Fund, especially in cases where, for example, a new policy is established that will facilitate access to finance, but then sometimes it takes a long time for this policy to actually be implemented to provide the necessary evidence to show that the policy actually works, because the accreditation process will assess how these policies work and will require evidence in terms of safeguards that are to do with the accreditation process and the transfer of money to these entities and institutions. So the accreditation panel, and through this publication, also identified some lessons of accessing finance from the Adaptation Fund based on the experience of different entities, institutions, and the different governments that are currently accessing finance from the Adaptation Fund. One of the lessons is that it's important to demonstrate evidence and the ability to apply policies by other sources of finance. So, for example, bilateral transfers, transfers from other donors, and to demonstrate how the entity in question or the government department that wants to access finance from the Adaptation Fund can apply and downscale these policies to safeguard resources independently from the donor or bilateral source of finance. So to incorporate these policies into their own operational mechanisms and operational structures. And then there is also a need to build a track record. And this is important because entities have to have some experience managing donor funds. And in addition to that, they need to have experience with project development and project delivery. And these can, if they are not climate change projects, then they should be at least development projects. And this is a challenge because some countries find it easier to have, say, for example, a commercial bank access because it already has experience with finance. And then they nominate that as the institution to access funding from the Adaptation Fund on behalf of the country. But the challenge with some commercial banks and for-profit entities is that they do not have experience with development projects because they are for-profit institutions, and that's just something to keep in mind. There's also a need to be flexible, and the entities need to be able to adapt and adjust to meeting new sets of criteria and adjusting their policies in line with the requirements of the accreditation process. I mentioned communication before, and it's important to enhance communication, particularly from the institutional perspective of using its communication channels. So for example, its website. And in terms of accessing climate finance, one of the things that the accreditation panel of the Adaptation Fund will check is whether some policies, for example, on grievance handling, complaint mechanisms, are actually available on the institution's website, and whether it will be easy for an ordinary person or a lay person to go on that website and find a click button or a template of where they can submit either a complaint or a comment or what have you, and it's part of the structures that will be assessed by the panel in terms of accessing finance from the Adaptation Fund. So there's also a need to account for organizational change, and we have seen this happen in terms of, so for example, when governments change or leadership in governments change, there might be a new administration coming into the government, and that sometimes usually results in a restructuring of government departments, a change in departmental mandate or the mandate of some ministries, and it can also lead to change in legal status. So, for example, the establishment of parastatals that start working on, say, for example, environment or other sectors. So these are important to consider because then they affect the whole process of accessing finance from the fund, because when the accreditation panel is going through the documentation, then it will check the legal status of such institutions and entities, and some of these changes can lead to delays in the process of getting accredited and accessing finance. And then I'll just end by saying one of the big lessons is that some countries find it quicker to use third-party agents to access money from the Adaptation Fund, and this is also possible. It's one of the mechanisms of using UN agencies to implement projects. While this is possible, the fund deliberately promotes and supports direct access, which is what I mentioned earlier. And going through the direct access process in itself is a capacity building process because it increases country ownership, and supports, decision-making at the national and sub-national level, and it raises the profile of both the government agency or the institution that is going through the accreditation process internationally. And this helps. We've seen this in other countries like Senegal and Rwanda, where the entities that went through the accreditation process to access finance from the Adaptation Fund ended up being the national focal points of those institutions and receiving other sources of finance, not only from the Adaptation Fund, but from other donors and other sources of international finance. So, what are some of the things that the Adaptation Fund is doing to address some of these gaps? And before I get into some of these things, I just wanted to mention also that, so readiness support, at least from the Adaptation Fund perspective, is supposed to support three main things. And first, it's supposed to provide support for accreditation of entities with the UNFCCC finance mechanisms. And the finance mechanisms include the GEF and the Green Climate Fund. And outside of the GEF, accreditation is a requirement to access finance from the Green Climate Fund, and it is the same with the Adaptation Fund. So that's one of the main purposes that the fund has a readiness program. The second reason is to support access to climate finance, support project design, support project development and delivery. And then the third is to support overall progressive learning. And in this, there is the culture of direct access, which I mentioned. So in terms of how the readiness program of the fund is set up, is basically, its purpose is to provide support to receive grants from the Adaptation Fund, both grants for projects, but the readiness program itself also has grants that it provides to support capacity building in countries. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. And to support accreditation, I've mentioned that, project preparation and design. We contribute to knowledge management, and it also provides visibility for the Adaptation Fund. So in terms of grants that are available to support access to climate finance from the Adaptation Fund, we have a grant called the Readiness Package Grant. This grant is meant to support the direct access modality. So it's meant to support accreditation as a national implementing entity. And it's the grant is up to a maximum of $150,000 per entity that is seeking accreditation with the fund. The way the grant is structured is it goes through an intermediary. So the intermediary can be another an already accredited national implementing entity, which will provide peer support to the entity seeking accreditation with the fund. So the grant is meant to support South-South peer support for accreditation to the Adaptation Fund. And the Adaptation Fund Secretariat is involved in providing guidelines and tools and instruments to guide the process of accreditation, whereas the intermediary, which is the provider of peer support, will be involved in the actual hands-on day-to-day support of the entity or institution that is seeking accreditation with the Adaptation Fund. There is also support for project development available through grants and non-grant support from the Adaptation Fund. And again, the Secretariat will provide guidance, tools and instruments to support the process of project development, the process of project implementation, and basically the whole project cycle for the Adaptation Fund. And there are also grants to support with environmental and social safeguards and integrating gender at the institutional level. So we call these technical assistance grants, and they are basically meant to support the development or enhancement of environmental and social safeguard policies and gender policies within institutions that are accessing finance from the Adaptation Fund. And this is crossed out. There was an additional grant that has recently been stopped. It was called the Project Formulation Assistance Grant to support with project formulation. But although it has been stopped, the amount has been incorporated into another existing grant, which is also supporting project development, project formulation. So some of the non-grant activities that are available include seminars that the Adaptation Fund hosts. We have an annual seminar, but this is a closed event. Only open to already accredited national implementing entities that are using the direct access modality of the fund. We also have publications. So for example, we have this study on readiness and capacity building, which looks at the readiness program of the Adaptation Fund, compares it with capacity building and the readiness program from the Green Climate Fund and from the GEF. And it has some lessons learned in terms of providing overall capacity building support to developing countries. And we also have webinars and regional workshops. And we try to invite and include all countries within a region that are eligible to receive funding from the Adaptation Fund when we host regional workshops, and we sometimes hold international global level kind of workshops, which talk about accessing finance from the Adaptation Fund and all our processes and procedures and the like. And these workshops sometimes also we cover national adaptation planning, NDCs, and how that is linked to receiving finance from the Adaptation Fund. So we also have country exchanges where we have participants. It's a form of peer support for project design and development. And this was mostly during the time of before COVID, but we are looking forward to resuming these country exchanges from next year onwards as well. And then I think one of the last things I'll mention is we have this community of practice. We call it a community of practice for direct access entities. And what it is the Adaptation Fund, in partnership with the Green Climate Fund, are both actively providing financial and non-financial support towards the establishment of this community. It's now established, it's operational, and it's a community of accredited national implementing entities from the Adaptation Fund and accredited direct access entities from the Green Climate Fund that have come together and autonomously are running the community. So the Adaptation Fund and Green Climate Fund are observers. It's an initiative in a direction that both funds have never really done before, where we take a seat or a step back and let the entities themselves decide on their governance, their capacity needs, and we provide financial support and other non-financial support to enable them to address the needs as they identify them themselves. So this community has so far raised about $1.3 million. It's made up of currently a membership of about 21 countries that have accredited entities with either one of the two funds. And they have decided what they have identified, self-identified the challenges and gaps they are facing, and have self-identified the manner in which they want to address these gaps and the solutions they have put forward. So they have an action plan to identify capacity needs in terms of project design and development and accessing climate finance broadly for both adaptation and mitigation. And they're going to actively start implementing this action plan from this year with support from the GIZ, which is the delivery partner that is working with them on this. And it's still open to continued membership by new entities that are accredited to both funds. So I'll end my presentation by just talking about some of the funding windows available. I mean, sitting through this webinar, I heard a lot of discussion and identification of capacity needs in terms of data collection, data availability, manipulating this data, and other systems. So this is just to mention that in terms of receiving financing from the Adaptation Fund, we are not prescriptive, and the finance from the Adaptation Fund can be used to finance a broad range of sectors and themes that cover all the range that is shown on the screen. And there is no limit in what, in terms of the sector and the themes that can be financed from funding from the Adaptation Fund, as long as it is an adaptation or resilience-based theme or sector. And I know this is the very last slide. I know it's a loaded slide, but these are all the funding windows available under the Adaptation Fund. They are structured to follow the medium-term strategy pillars of the fund, which is made up of 3 pillars: action, innovation, and learning and sharing. So under each of those 3 pillars, there are different funding windows. I won't go through them one by one in detail, but because I know this PowerPoint is going to be shared also with participants, but I wanted to flag that a lot of these funding windows, you'll see it says NIE, 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 NIE. Some exclusively only say NIE. And this goes back to what I was saying before about direct access. And NIE is an institution that is accessing finance from the fund using the direct access modality. So you see that in terms of the Adaptation Fund's drive, it is purposely or purposefully supporting direct access to the fund's resources. So some of these funding windows will not be available to UN agencies, will not be available to multilateral development banks and other organs that currently can access still funding from the fund using what we call the regional implementing entity or multilateral implementing entity, and they're exclusively available to the NIE. So we encourage and support countries to use NIEs to access resources from the Adaptation Fund so that they can directly have control over the projects they implement or they design, and also have direct control over the finance that is transferred to those countries to access funds. So I will end there, and some of these projects in terms of implementation will address some of those gaps in terms of setting up data collection, data gathering systems. As I mentioned before in the presentation, some of these funds have been used to set up early warning systems, can be used to set up knowledge management systems in country, and can be used to build capacity in terms of data collection, data gathering software, training individuals and training representatives of governments and entities in terms of meeting some of those gaps and needs that have been identified by the 6 countries. And I'll just end, this is the last slide, I'll just end by saying of the 6 countries that have done the research in this webinar, only 2 countries so far, which is the Dominican Republic and Uganda, have got accredited national implementing entities under the Adaptation Fund. So for Dominican Republic, we have the Dominican Institute of Integral Development. It is already accredited and accessing funds directly from the Adaptation Fund. And for Uganda, we have the Ministry of Water and Environment, which is also accessing funds directly from the Adaptation Fund. And I think both of them have projects that are already being funded. But we can now have 2 accredited entities per country. So we can still have an additional entity from each of these countries. Zambia, Niger have already put forward entities that are going through the accreditation process, but we do not have an entity yet put forward for Madagascar and Guatemala. So the process is ongoing, it's an ongoing process, and we encourage governments and the entities to seek funding from the Adaptation Fund and contact us for any information or extra help or support that you may need. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Faray, and let me introduce myself, Ignacio Lorenzo. I am also co-coordinator with Pilar Bueno. She has to leave the room. She's moving now to Buenos Aires for a climate change meeting. So thank you very much, Dr. Faray, for your presentation. We are now 2 minutes past the hour, and indeed we need to end this on time. So in that regard, I will only allow for one question from anyone on the group who wishes to address any of the previous speakers. If there's any question, at least one unique question, of course, we can also present further questions offline later. So let me open the mic if there is anyone
who wishes to make a final question for anyone on the panel of previous speakers. So please, Evrima from Gambia, please. Your mic is muted. Perhaps you can.
Okay, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity. Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead. Thank you very much for your
intervention. Good afternoon from the Gambia. Good afternoon from the Gambia. I work for the Soil Solution Gambia as an executive director, and also the Gambia National Soil Partnership, which is coordinated by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And it has been so long. This is my 4th year following the Adaptation Fund website, and also following all their mailing list and then updates. But actually, I hardly see opportunities for civil society organizations or NGOs when it comes to funding in terms of Adaptation Fund. And I noticed that there is a focal person for Adaptation Fund in the Gambia who works at the Ministry of Environment. And then I have a meeting with him the other time, but he said Adaptation Funds are only accessed by government institutions or national governments. And I want to ask the question to say, is it possible for CSOs or NGOs to have direct access from Adaptation Fund? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. And please, Dr. Fayadi, if you wish to answer our colleague from the Gambia. Thank you very much for the question.
Thank you for the question. And just to say, actually, I'm not a doctor, and it's just Farai. That is just to clarify. But yes, so there are opportunities for civil society organizations and non-governmental organizations to access funding from the Adaptation Fund. We have a funding window under the innovation funding window that is available to non-accredited entities. However, this window is through what we call an accelerator, and that accelerator currently is the UNIP, CTCN, and UNIP. So, and it's available on our website, and I can provide a link in the chat. And that is a funding window that is being financed by the Adaptation Fund, but it is meant for innovation projects, and it is available to civil society organizations and NGOs. If you are not accredited and you still want to access, you can approach any of the accredited entities in your country, and a lot of them are open to you having a discussion of a proposal that you want to submit for funding, and they will be happy to incorporate it into their own program, which they will submit to the Adaptation Fund for funding. And that's another way that you can get around that issue.
Thank you very much, Farai, for your answer, and I believe it was very well explained. So thank you also our colleague from the Gambia for the question. So now let me just give the floor to Ma'am Eva Costas from the PCCB, so she can also close our meeting. Please, Eva.
Thank you very much, Ignacio. Thank you very much to the Impulsouth team for hosting this webinar and for collaborating with the Adaptation. I think Lily was already sort of mentioning in the opening that the goal of the PCCB network, and I think it's definitely this is sort of what the network achieves to do, and sort of bringing together different organizations and hosting events like this one, sort of bringing in different experts around and sort of share their experience and work on capacity building on different topics. So just being really mindful of time, I'll try to quickly bring your attention to the PCCB network. It was set up by the PCCB as a voluntary driven association of stakeholders engaged in climate change capacity building. So one of its objectives is of sort of bringing these different stakeholders together to share information and good practices of their work and contribute to the work of the PCCB in fulfilling its mandate. We currently have a bit over 300 member organizations, and we welcome many more from 80 different countries. So the network is very diverse. Queremos darles también la bienvenida a cualquier organizaciones que trabajen en el fomento de capacidades para el cambio climático de la región de Latinoamérica. On veut également inviter à des organisations francophones qui travaillent sur le renforcement de capacités sur le changement climatique. Hopefully I was able to cover some of the languages of this session. My colleagues will be sending the links over in the chat, and for you to become a member and join the network. You can also sort of receive the latest updates and information on the PCCB network and the capacity building team at the UNFCCC Secretariat by joining the LinkedIn group. And since COP is around the corner, I also want to bring out to your attention the 4th Capacity Building Hub, which will be taking place at the COP from the 9th till the 16th of November. Again, another space that will be hosting various different events around various different topics around capacity building and bringing in different stakeholders from different regions and sectors. So if you're in Sharm el Sheikh around that time, you're very much welcome to join and follow the discussions, but also you'll be able to follow along with the live stream. And with that, thanks again to the organizers, the panelists, the audience for the great discussions, and I wish you all a great rest of your day. Thank you, gracias, merci, et bonne journée à tous.
Thank you very much, Eva, for your closing remarks. And in behalf of Impulsouth project, and also thanking our colleagues from the Adaptation Fund, we are coming here to an end. And just to inform you that all the reports from all the teams, the research teams, national research teams from all 6 countries in the Impulsouth project will be shared via web-based for everyone who wishes to consult them. So thank you very much. And we are concluding our webinar today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you
all. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
so much.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Jean-Marie.
Bye
Jean-Marie
bye.
around?
Au revoir.
Jean-Marie, are you around?
On se parle.
Jean-Marie,
Au revoir, Jean-Marie.